Welcome to Twisting Paradigms in Real Life, the podcast where we explore the real life stories of leaders who are learning to lead stronger and change wiser. I'm your host, Kate McCaffrey, founder of Paradigm Twist. Here we'll talk about what it really takes to lead in today's world, the messy middle, the twists and turns, and the insights that shift the way we think, work, and grow. Each conversation brings you practical strategies, fresh perspectives, and a little inspiration to help you twist your own paradigm. Let's get started. Welcome to Twisting Paradigms in Real Life, where we explore transformative ideas to navigate life's challenges. In today's episode, we're diving into the concept of resilience with Dr. Melinda Stoops. We'll explore how resilience isn't just about bouncing back, but about growing through adversity. Hey there, welcome back to Twisting Paradigms in Real Life. Today we're talking about resilience in challenging times and why it's important to us to really think about resilience, not only as something we strive towards, but as something we grow with ourselves. And I'm excited to have Dr. Melinda Stoops here, who's going to highlight her experience through psychology, mental health, and leadership around this idea of how do we create resilience in all of different frames and the context that we have, and thinking about it and thinking about how do we build the skills and the capacity to be more resilient, especially when we're in challenging times. And I think we often think of resilience as something we need to bounce back. And I would say that oftentimes we want to have resilience, and this will help us have some ideas about how we might do this. And I think it's really about how do we move beyond just toughing it out or recognizing that, oh, this is a hard time, I just need to get through it, and really understanding the difference between innate and learned resilience and how do we think about it that way. And so, Melinda, I'd love to have you just share a little bit about your work that you're doing and your definition and your pillars of resilience.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, Kate, for inviting me. As a psychologist, I've always been interested in resilience. But to give some context, a few years ago, I met two people out at UMass Amherst who were teaching a class on resilience and getting some really, really nice results from the students who took the class, where students had pre and post, course measures of increasing resilience, greater sense of belongingness and community. And so I worked with them to learn about their course and teaching it. And what's interesting is I think, resilience isn't like, how do I say this? I guess at a basic level, it's not this like really difficult thing to do, but I think there has to be some intentionality in doing it. Because as you said, sometimes our tendency is to power through when things go wrong or to sort of settle into unhealthy routines. But for me, I really think of resilience as one, self-care, like at a very basic level. Like we don't have to go to the gym every day, but we just need to be mindful of engaging in behaviors that are more health affirming than not. And we don't have to be perfect at it, but again, more than not. Secondly, I think to recognize that we all have strengths and that we flourish from our strengths. And when we're feeling overwhelmed, to really look at what strengths can I use to deal with this, because that goes a long way. And then lastly, just the connections with others. I think relationships are so powerful. And I've always believed that. And I think, especially in a time where times are tough, just that connection goes a long way in building resilience. You don't even have to talk about what's bothering you, but just having that support network and connections with others. Yeah.
And I think there's some power in having a mindset, and how do we, for ourselves and for those who work directly with others, shift from that, oh, woe is me, or a victim mindset to a more growth oriented. And I think that's where the challenges can happen, especially when there's so much happening and there's so much that we don't know, or uncertainty. I think we're hearing a lot about that, or constant change, I think. And so what would be the barrier that you think that people face when they're trying to cultivate resilience for themselves?
I think, well, one, I want to acknowledge when you say constant change, I think I want to acknowledge that change is hard. Like even good change, like let's say someone gets this great promotion and they're so excited about it. There's going to be transition time and stress associated with that. So I think we need to acknowledge that one, change is constant and change is hard. So not to get us sidetracked, but I think we need to acknowledge that piece. And I think we do often get derailed because we tend to a lot of times focus on what's going wrong versus what's going right. And so when
Uh-huh.
people are feeling overwhelmed and stressed out, I think the inclination is to say, I had a bad day, this and this and this happened. And that all may be true, but that's
Uh,
not going to be helpful in the long run to
Right, right.
perseverate on that. And I'm not saying you don't acknowledge what's wrong, but I think really good at getting more intentional about how we think about things that we can say, yeah, like today was a crappy day. It was
Uh-huh.
miserable. And what can I do tonight to make myself feel better about it? Like, what's in my control that I can do better? And
Uh-huh.
also, this is one day. This isn't every day. And yesterday was just fine. So this doesn't mean that every day is going to be miserable. So I think just being mindful of our self talk and ways that can drag us down and catching ourselves
Uh-huh.
thinking in a way that actually could be making us feel worse rather than making us feel better.
Yeah, I think sometimes we just get stuck in our own
Yeah.
heads. And you've
Uh-huh.
done recently some conversations and a recent blog post around sort of when our amygdalas get
Yeah.
hacked and who has the remote
Mhm.
control and how do we take back some of that control and
Yeah.
use our own strengths, as you said, to be able to move through whatever challenging situation is going on. And I think, one of the things I'm often saying these days too, and you just said it as well, is like, this is the environment we're in
Uh-huh.
and it's not
Yeah.
changing. So what
Uh-huh.
does need to change? I think sometimes
Yes.
it's our approach or our mindset or our behavior.
Uh-huh.
How would you say that people can do this in creating a culture within their group or their organization from a behavioral standpoint when we think about culture and how we show up for each other? What are some things you think people could do to help build a culture around this idea of resilience?
Well, I think at an organizational level, if we think intentionally about resilience, first of all, encouraging self-care. I feel like there's always a culture of people working through lunch or
Uh-huh.
putting in extra hours and then not giving themselves the grace to come in late the next day or maybe take a day off later in the week. And so I think the more we can encourage self-care and leadership to model that, because it's one thing
Uh-huh.
to have your boss say, you've worked so hard, take tomorrow off, when they never do that. So then you feel like, yeah, I'd love to, but I don't know. Do as I say, not as I do is not helpful. And I think the strengths, it was at another campus last week, and we were talking about just strengths and the idea that strengths are so important, and we get these roles that are assigned to us just because the role was created and then you get hired into it. But our
Uh-huh.
roles don't always necessarily align with our strengths. And it doesn't mean you redo your whole role, that you still have your role, but perhaps someone in the department who's tasked with assessment, for example, does that play with their strengths? Or
Uh,
maybe they're not the best person to do it and they don't like it, where there's someone else who's like, assessment, I love it, and that's their strengths. And so there may be individual tasks that can be
Uh-huh.
shifted among a group that really play to one another's strengths. And that can just really not only build resilience, but build excitement about those types of tasks. And then I think the
Uh-huh.
more we can do just to build community, that we spend a lot of time at work together. And I would say we don't have to all be friends, but it would be nice if we not only respect each other, but create a culture of caring and just supporting one another. So again, I'm going
Sure.
back to those three pillars, but I think they all sound good and they're so basic, but we don't intentionally structure our lives that way. And that can be done at an organizational level as well.
Yeah, I think what you just said resonates with me, and I was one of those leaders, unfortunately.
Mm.
You don't know what you don't know in the moment, would say to
Yeah.
people, "Don't do as I say, do as I do." I'm not a great model for this, and part of it was me just being vulnerable of, "I this is hard for me too."
Hmm.
And how do we help each other?
Yeah.
And then the other piece I think that you talked about too is how do we know each other? I think
Hmm.
that's the other thing is that if we know each other and have that relationship, again, not best friends, right? But how do
Hmm.
we know like you show up differently than I do? And,
Yep.
for me, it was always, especially around this time of year, around budgets and
Mhm.
projections and all those kinds of things is when a lot of campuses are doing this work. And
Yeah.
I was good friends and made good friends with the CFO so that if I had a question on a spreadsheet, because those are not my strength, that I could go to him and
Mhm.
say, hey, this is your happy place. Can you help me
Yeah.
understand it? And he would show up at an event with people and he'd be like, okay, this is not my happy place. I'm leaving. Or yes, I'll do this because you asked me to, but it's not what he was comfortable with. And having that knowledge of each other on that level and the
Mhm.
ability to feel comfortable just going and saying, hey, I think you're good, better at this than I am. Can
Mhm.
you help me with this? Or are there ways that you would suggest people who are in an organization or on a team feel like if they're in a role or a task and they don't have the skill set or capacity
Mhm.
and they need support, what are ways that they can talk to a leader who might be like,
Mhm.
this is your job, you need to do it, or that's the culture and they're trying to change it from within? Because I think that's what
Mhm.
we're seeing too, is that there are people in the middle of the organization who are
Yeah.
trying to be resilient, but they're not getting that support.
Well, and I think, when you think of feeling overwhelmed by a task or a job, I think the question is this a skill you can learn? Like sometimes it's like, you go in and you're teaching a class and there's a new learning platform that you don't know how to do it, but if someone just taught you, you'd be fine. So I think there are
Uh-huh.
things like that where are you getting the support to get the skills you need? Like, is it a training issue? And if so, I think it's fair to say, look, I don't know anything. Well, maybe a little bit about this, but I'd like to learn more about assessment. And can I go to a
Uh-huh.
conference or take a class or learn this? Which I think is, again, looking at a task that can be learned. But then when we think about strengths, also, what does that involve? Like, if someone is in a role where you mentioned the example of someone going out and doing an event, like if you're an introvert and maybe you can go do that, but it's really draining for you, that it comes at a price for you as an employee to be asked to do that all the time because you're going to be drained and it's going to be harder for you to bounce back and then go into your next task, if that makes sense. So I think if we look at like, is this something that I just need the skills, or is this really more of a misalignment with who I am as a person and my strengths and my energy level, and maybe there's someone else that's actually better suited to take that on, and in return, I'd be willing to take this on, if
Mhm,
that makes
mhm.
sense.
Yeah, that makes sense a lot, and I think building that confidence first, right,
Yeah.
and being
Yeah.
able to recognize for yourself first what you might need
Mhm.
or and I think not being afraid to say something even if it doesn't come out perfectly, right? I think that
Yeah.
sometimes we get in our own way with trying to ask for that type of
Mhm.
help.
Yeah, and I think, it's interesting as I say that, I mean, I acknowledge that it sounds great in theory, but the thought of going in and saying to your supervisor, like, "Look, this is just misaligned with my energy," like, how is that gonna go? So I think the more that leaders can create a space where people feel comfortable having uncomfortable conversations and that you don't wait to have uncomfortable conversations until it's performance evaluation time and all of a sudden you're
Right,
like this is
right.
like it's just part of like every day, and also asking for feedback and giving permission for people to bring things up with you and responding in a way that is supportive of that goes a long way so that these conversations can happen. And I also believe, we all have our own styles of supervising. So when you're meeting with a team, let's say you have four people reporting to you, like you have your style that you bring to all four. But I think
Mhm,
if it's possible to be aware of the reality that those are 4 very different people and you bring your style, but they may need different things from you.
mhm,
And so one
mhm.
person may really need you to be very like structured and say, this is how
Uh-huh,
we're going to
uh-huh.
like organize our time today. And someone else may really thrive in a more free flowing because that's where they get their creativity and they're saying, "Oh, now I have this idea and I'm gonna get excited to go do it." So I think it's also that combination of
Uh-huh.
recognizing that we are who we are, but also to try and flex to give people space to bring themselves to our work.
And I think too, as a supervisor or manager, it's about how do we understand that and ask the
Yeah.
questions and take that
Mhm.
time to really get to know people. And I think
Yeah.
that's where some of the assessments, and I know you're really familiar with DISC, not DISC, but
Mhm.
strengths, and I do DISC. And so I think that's why I'm often encouraging people,
Mhm.
even as an individual in a engagement, to do
Mhm.
an assessment, because that's data.
Mhm.
Whether it resonates or not, that's a data too, right? And
Yep.
understanding ourselves first, and then thinking about, okay, if someone else is approaching this from the exact opposite
Yep.
and thinking about the disc circle, this is going to cause some challenges. And so, how do
Mhm.
we understand that and know that in order to be able to create a relationship versus just avoid the relationship? Because I
Right,
think
exactly.
instead of doing some of these things and taking the
Mhm.
time, we're just like, I just won't engage. I'll just do what I need to
Yeah.
do and put my head down. And that's, I think, where we're seeing some of this quieter kind of
Mhm.
disengagement across the board.
Yeah,
And I
right,
do
and
wonder if
that's
there's a connection there. Yeah.
yeah, and I feel like that is that the person, there's only so much energy we can bring to these types of things because in the meantime, we're
Mhm.
doing our jobs, which takes a lot of energy. And so I
Right.
think when people try and change things and they keep bumping up against it, that sooner or later, unless someone is really, really determined, that there's a point where you're just like, well, I'm going to adapt in this way just to deal with it
Mhm.
because it
Uh-huh.
feels easier than continuing to battle something that no one else seems to be responding to.
Right. Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think that's where some of the challenges come in, and when we have choices to make, right? About
Mhm.
how we decide to show up in that space, and if we
Yeah,
decide that we want to be in a different environment or different
exactly.
space. And I think not all environments are toxic, but yet they may seem that way if we're in it
Mhm.
all the time. And so how do we understand that and regulate? And that's where I think when we talked back in November and did our session at NASPA, it was about sort of, for me, it was about reflecting on, okay, how
Mhm.
did I get to the point of feeling like I couldn't do my role anymore in the
Yeah.
way that I wanted to? And coming up with this idea of this trifecta of, okay, if I
Mhm.
was really focused on three things, and that's really what I focus on too, is, and I think you do too, is that what's our small things that we can
Mhm.
do? Because we
Yeah.
don't need to do 25 things or big
Mhm.
things. And for me, around resilience, the three things that for me are priorities are around steadiness, care, and transparency. And I think
Mm.
sharing that with leaders and groups has been really, I think, valuable. And I say, if those words don't resonate for you, make your own trifecta, but really
Yeah.
kind of think about what are some ways that we can almost teach ourselves how
Yeah.
to come off that roller coaster or hamster wheel that gets in the way. Are you seeing that people are looking for those types of strategies too in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I think, that in higher ed in particular, this is just it's been a year. It's been a tough year, and I think people really are looking for ways to reclaim some stability, and
Uh-huh.
with that, that gets at that both in terms of just presence at work and responding to what's going on, and then leaders with how to be more intentional and supporting their team because maybe what's worked in the past isn't working now because it's the stress has escalated and it's been long term and things aren't changing. And I feel like when I think of resilience, I also think a lot about the idea that, and I say this all the time, we can't control everything that happens to us.
Uh-huh.
Like we can't control if layoffs are happening or if there's pressure to turn in some big report tomorrow when you didn't know about it or whatever. Like maybe we can't control those, but we can control how we choose to respond. And
Uh-huh.
we always have a choice in how we respond.
Uh-huh.
Sometimes we may have more limited choices than others, and sometimes those choices aren't all ideal. But I think recognizing that can go a long way when you're feeling really overwhelmed in terms of, okay, what are my options in terms of
Uh-huh.
handling this? And recognizing that you do have some choices.
Yeah, and I think that, one of the tools that I've started using is this circle of control, right? And so
Mhm.
understanding that really all we can control is a small amount of what
Mhm.
we can.
Yep.
And then we can influence, certainly, a broader circle of whether
Mhm.
it's an issue or people or things in the world.
Yeah.
But then we can care about things, but it's hard sometimes to get out of the mindset of, I really care about this and I want to be able to feel like I'm in control. Like,
Yeah.
for instance, there's a lot of unexpected things that are happening, and a lot of
Mhm.
organizations, I think, especially on campuses, are reducing budgets, restructuring, being able to think about positions and what they need and eliminate them or move
Mhm.
people. around or not fill positions when they're vacated. And I think when those unexpected things happen, it's harder to come back to
Yeah.
this idea of resilience. And I think how do we allow people to feel all the feelings that go along with that type of change?
Yeah.
And then also build some acceptance and some trust back when the
Yeah.
environment is one we can't predict.
Right. It is unpredictable. And I think unpredictable in a long term way. And I agree. And I think it's not, I don't want to give up and say, oh, we can't do any of that. But again, like when you think about what you can do, like, do you have any control over your schedule where you could say, you know what? I'm going to start every morning with something I enjoy so that when I wake
Mhm,
up in the morning, I'm not dreading going to work and
mhm,
facing that
mhm,
first task. And it's like, oh, I got to go in and deal with this. Like, can you do
mhm,
that? Can you build in even half-hour break? Can you,
mhm.
like, what can you do to control, like, when everything else feels out of control? What can you do with your schedule or you know what I mean? Like just even little things like that can go a long way. I think for most people, and someone will come back with an example where no, I have the schedule, I can't do that. But I think looking at how that really works, I think most people can make some tweaks that
Uh-huh.
do that. And I think again, it's like, okay, we're on a wild ride right now, and what can I do? And you can put on your seatbelt, like think of the whole airplane and the oxygen,
Right.
and you put
Yep.
on your
Yep.
oxygen. And what does that look like? Well, at work, that may be, adjusting your schedule, taking a break, stopping maybe
Mhm,
minutes before the hour instead of on
mhm.
the hour, so you
Yep.
can like get some
Breathe
water
in
or go to the
between.
bathroom or just, whatever. I think there really has to be, and again, those don't take away the stress, but they allow you to approach it in a better way than if you don't
Mhm.
have all of that happening, because then it's nonstop pressure.
Right. And I think that was one of the challenges that I always had. And if there are people
Yeah.
listening who I used to work with, they're probably laughing right now. But I think I would have time in my calendar and then I wouldn't pay attention to it.
Yep.
But the strategy of how can you not schedule hour-long meetings? I think a lot
Yep.
of campuses, even or organizations during the pandemic, had some of those barriers, boundaries in place for each other
Mhm.
where you couldn't schedule a meeting for an hour. It was either 30 or 45 minutes or
Mm.
20 or 45, depending.
Yeah.
I had a couple different groups I was working with at the time. And I think that was brilliant.
Yeah.
And I think, why haven't we done this sooner?
Mhm. Right.
And even
Why do
if
we
we're
need
in
an
a
hour? That's
right,
a
we don't
made up
need an
number,
hour.
you
It
know?
is a made up number. And I do think it's a very higher education specific number
Yeah.
in some ways. And so how do we both create a community and have that support
Mhm.
so we're not just having meetings to have meetings, but
Yep.
also respecting each other's time in a way that if we don't have to, or if it could be an
Mhm.
email or if it could be a shorter conversation, how do we do that? And how do we
Yeah.
even try? And I think that's part of resilience, right? Is trying these new ways of approaching both our
Mhm.
own calendar and time. Because really, that's all that we can control. Can't
Exactly.
control what someone's going to say once they're in front of you. However, you can control when and how they do that. And
Mhm.
I think that that's valuable for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And like even with our conversation today, like last week I was just swamped, and I think I said to you like, "Oh, this is a terrible week. Can we do this next week?" Because I knew like sure I could have said like, "Oh, I want to help Kate out and I'll, be
Mhm.
accommodating," but like in the end I didn't have to do that. And
Right.
I gave
Yep.
myself grace to be like, "Let's just schedule it this week." And I have so much more
Mhm.
breathing room to do
Right.
this as
Yeah.
opposed to
Yeah.
squeezing it in and then making myself miserable because I have
Mhm.
less time to just breathe in
Right.
between meetings.
Right. And I think too I think for both of us kind of running our own shops at this
Mhm.
point too, I think for me it's about how do I shift my own mindset of the go, 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 structure, structure,
Yeah.
structure all the time. And for me too, it's creating that space, right? How do
Mhm.
I maybe, I wrote my dissertation between 4:30 and 7:30 for 2 months every
Yeah.
morning and didn't realize physically what that was doing to me.
Mhm.
Mentally it was accomplishment and getting it done. But on the other hand, that was my best time to work. It's still my best time to work. But now I can control my schedule and I can be like, okay,
Right.
I'm going to do this for this hour and then go for a walk here or go exercise here. And I know that there's a luxury in that
Mm.
flexibility, but at the same time, how do we create more space
Mhm.
for our own well-being as well as
Yeah.
model that for others? Because I think that's where people are really challenged right now is how do I do this for myself, but then also how do I model it for other leaders?
Yeah, and for our students. Like, I
Mhm.
think of students, like, and I've been terrible at this at times and better at other times, but I think like a lot of offices have student employees. And what do
Uh-huh.
they learn? Well, they learn that no one takes lunch, that everyone works through lunch, and we're trying to tell them, oh, be healthy, take care of yourself. And, like, what are we teaching them about the world of work and what it's like to be in a professional position? You know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
And so I think that we're thinking about our team, but also the students that in higher ed, that our mission is there to help guide them and develop in multiple ways. And
Uh-huh.
again, they see what we're doing and what we're not doing.
Uh-huh. And I think that speaks to culture, right? I think from
Mhm.
a campus perspective or an organization perspective, it's about how are we creating a culture where if that's a value and we're
Mhm.
putting time and resources towards it, we have to
Yeah.
be able to teach it and model it, especially
Mhm.
if we're a learning organization. And
Yeah.
I think that's where we're potentially missing is really thinking about it from a bigger picture standpoint, especially as we're bringing in new team members or
Mhm.
even new students or new faculty and staff. How are we setting them up for success in a way
Yeah.
that helps them understand a culture that's one of both self care and self awareness? But
Mhm.
how do we be resilient together, knowing that things are going to be challenging at times?
Yeah.
Have you seen
Exactly.
any organizations that are starting to really think about that from a cultural standpoint as we think about this idea of resilience? I'm not sure I
Um,
have, which is why I'm asking you. I don't know that there's
well, I
anyone that
do,
I've
and
seen doing it really well.
I don't want to throw out a
Yeah.
name of a school, but like there's a local community college in Massachusetts who has been working with someone on resilience for, oh gosh, I bet at least the last 3 years, like continuing to
Uh-huh.
work with a consultant focused on that. And I'm like,
Uh-huh.
that's amazing. Like that
Uh-huh.
you're sticking with it because I think a lot of times you're like, oh, we're going to bring someone in, we're going to talk about it. And then it's like,
Yeah,
oh, that
the
was lovely. And then, 2 weeks later, we're all doing the same old stuff. And and I know resources are tight for a lot of institutions, but it doesn't mean like you need someone coming and consulting every week. It could even be
right.
like doing something and then whether it's like at the start of every semester or something just to remind or do check-ins or something
Uh-huh.
to keep that pulse check going. So
Right.
we keep moving forward because new habits are that's what we're saying. We're developing new habits. And,
Right.
for anyone who's tried to like start exercising or quit smoking or I don't know,
Uh-huh.
be neater if they're very messy. New habits are hard to create and maintain. So the more we can structure it where we have external like encouragement, the
Yeah.
better.
And I think that's the hardest for me is talking with past clients where they've brought me in for a day or day and a half,
Mhm.
and then we do follow up a few months later, or some cases even I'm revisiting with former clients from earlier in my time just to talk about what I'm doing now. And they're like, well, we really didn't do anything with what you gave
Yeah.
us because X, Y, or Z happened, or
Mhm.
this person left, or we got a new leader in this role. And so our priorities had to change and we haven't been able to from a capacity standpoint. And I
Yeah.
think, they often want to be able to,
Mhm.
but in some
Yeah.
ways feel like they can't, right? And they
Mhm.
can't take the time to do that. So I love the idea of having a focus on something, whether it's
Mhm.
resilience or care, and being able to really, even if it's once a month, right, create
Right.
space for
Stick with
people
it.
to come and talk about it. And how do you
Mhm.
stick with it? Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great insight. Anything else, Belinda, as we wrap up our conversation that you want to leave people with?
I guess going back to the idea of change, it's so easy to stay comfortable in the way we're at, even if it's
Uh-huh.
uncomfortable. That is just,
Uh-huh.
it takes less effort to just keep doing what you're doing than to try and
Uh-huh.
make a big change. But if you look at a situation and realize it's not healthy, that people are getting burnt out, or there's like a lot of stress connected to it, that that shorter term pain of pushing the change is so much worth it in the end
Uh-huh.
that you can
Uh-huh.
get. Recognizing that it's gonna feel hard, and again, like you said, you have to kinda stick with it and do it, but in the end, the payoff is so much worth it.
Yeah, I think that's a great twist to have people really think about how do we be consistent and
Mhm.
keep moving through it even when it's difficult or when maybe we're not going to have all the people on the bus ready to go, but if we've
Yeah.
got 10% to start, can that be enough to kind of move that through the organization in a way that can help us get to another space, another
Mhm.
culture, another way of being? And I think those are the hardest things to change when we think about change is the
Yeah.
people. How do we really focus on that and be intentional about that? So I appreciate that
Right. Oh, yeah.
uncomfortableness as part of it for sure.
Yeah, and you're mentioning just like the 10%. Most movements start small.
Right.
Like most people
Yes.
are like,
Yes.
oh, all of a sudden we have 100,000 people who are going to do this. Usually it's a handful of people who start
Right.
things moving, and then, you get more
Mm-hmm.
people throughout it. So you don't need everyone jumping up and
Mm-hmm.
down to do it right away. But if you have, a few committed people, now I feel like I'm going to quote, is it Maya Angelou who says something about that? Yeah. But that,
Yeah, I think
yeah,
so. Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think too, it's, when we think about culture, we don't think about it that way either
yeah,
as a movement or as something that's growing. But if we
yeah.
want to change culture, it's the people that have to change.
Uh-huh.
And resilience is certainly something that everyone has their own way of doing it.
Yeah.
And how do we just create space for people to
Yeah.
understand themselves and each other and to be able to come together in community to support each other? It sounds like are your pillars to really think about that,
Yeah,
even if
definitely.
it means we're uncomfortable for a little while.
Yeah, yeah. Discomfort's not bad.
Right. And I think that's partially being resilient, right? Is being
Mhm.
able to be uncomfortable and knowing that it's not forever. I think that's the other piece where we
Exactly.
started was, it's a day, right? Let's
Yep.
just get through. We can get through, we can survive, but then how do we move to more of a thriving mindset for sure?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you spending some time today, Melinda, and talking about the work that you're doing and your knowledge and ideas and wisdom
Mhm.
around this idea of resilience. I think it's certainly relevant for people today. And I think people are really challenged and struggled. And so I appreciate you adding to the conversation and helping people think about, how they might twist their own paradigm as they
Oh,
think about the lives that they're leading now. So I appreciate that. Are there things that you want to share as we kind of wrap up our conversation at all?
I'm trying to think. I don't know, now feel put on the spot, like, "Oh, what can I share?" I guess this is silly, but I'm gonna share it because it's so important. Breathe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We all breathe all the time, but
Right.
when we're having a bad day, if you just stop
Yeah.
and focus on your breathing. So
Right.
that's something, it's free, it's easy, and it doesn't take that long. So
Right.
if you
And I
can't do
think
anything
anybody you
else,
can do it
just
anywhere. Yeah.
focus on your breathing and
Yeah,
relax a
and
bit.
that's something that I've started to do as someone
Yeah.
who often, walks around like
Yeah.
this. How do you just take a moment? And I
Yeah.
often tell my clients before they go into conversations that they know might be challenging or hard to be able
Um,
to, how do you reset your mindset in order
yep.
to be able to do that? So that's a great tip,
Yeah.
and it's free and doesn't cost
That is
anything
free
other than
and easy
a
and
few seconds.
exactly. So there you go. I'll
Well,
leave you with that. We'll all just
that's
breathe.
great. Breathe, just breathe.
Just breathe.
Thanks so much for spending some time, Melinda. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Kate. I appreciate the invite.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us on this journey into resilience. We hope today's discussion with Dr. Melinda Stoops has inspired you to reflect on your own resilience journey. For more insights and resources, be sure to check out the show notes and our specially prepared reflection guide. Both are linked in the episode description. Remember, resilience is a continuous practice, and with small, consistent actions, you can foster a resilient mindset. Until next time, keep growing and stay resilient. If you or a team member are struggling with how to stay resilient or adopt resilient behaviors, follow the link below to take advantage of my limited time buy one, get one coaching session offer. In the sessions, we will unravel what's getting in your way, create a few strategies to address those barriers, and translate those strategies into everyday habits.
Thanks for listening to Twisting Paradigms in Real Life. If something sparked a shift in your thinking, I'd love for you to share it or leave a review to help others find the show. You can also explore more at twistyourparadigm.com or join me on LinkedIn. And remember, change doesn't happen in the abstract. It happens in real life. One conversation, one choice, one paradigm twist at a time. See you next time.